You think you know entitlement? You haven't met Karen Henderson, president of the Lakeside Serenity Homeowners Association. An irony so profound it could curdle the very waters of the lake she so desperately tried to control. They demolished my lake cabin, reduced it to splinters and memories under the guise of a community improvement project. What these officious tyrants, in their beige upholstered delusion, failed to comprehend, what their meticulously drafted, utterly irrelevant bylaws couldn't account for, was a simple, immutable fact. I own the whole lake lot. Every grain of sand on its shoreline, every murky depth, every trembling reed. They had just declared war on a man who not only owned the battlefield but had written the rules of engagement before they even knew they were fighting. The first tremor of this realization wasn't anger, not yet. It was a cold, crystalline clarity, the kind that settles after a detonation, when the air is still and the full extent of the devastation is starkly, terribly visible. They thought they were pruning an overgrown bush on common land. They'd actually dynamited a monument on private, sovereign territory, and they had absolutely no idea the arsenal I was about to deploy. The initial violation notices had been laughable, escalating from the precise shade of my mailbox. Apparently, desert taupe was an affront to their woodland beige sensibilities, to the unauthorized height of a privacy hedge I hadn't even planted. Each communiqué, signed with Henderson's self-important flourish, was a masterpiece of petty tyranny, a testament to a mind unburdened by actual problems. My lake cabin, a small, unassuming structure my grandfather built with his own hands, a place where generations of my family had marked summers and escaped the world, became their new obsession. It was, according to their increasingly unhinged pronouncements, an eyesore, a blight on the community's aesthetic standards, and, most absurdly, an unpermitted structure encroaching on community access to the lake. Community access to my lake. The sheer, unadulterated gall was almost admirable in its purity. I'd sent polite, registered letters, complete with plat maps and deeds, highlighting the inconvenient truth of my ownership of the entire lake lot. They were ignored, dismissed as the ramblings of an uncooperative resident. They genuinely believed their little HOA fiefdom superseded actual land ownership records. The demolition of that lake cabin wasn't just an act of vandalism, it was a desecration. It was them spitting on my grandfather's legacy, on my family's history, on the very concept of private property. That was the line. They hadn't just crossed it, they'd obliterated it with a bulldozer fueled by ignorance and arrogance. The call from a sympathetic, though previously cowed, neighbor came on a Tuesday. "They're doing it," he'd whispered, his voice tight with a fear I now understood was endemic in that meticulously manicured suburban hellscape. "They're tearing down your cabin at the lake." I remember the silence in my study, the way the motes of dust hung suspended in the afternoon light, each one a tiny frozen moment before the storm. My response, when it came, was not to him, but to myself, a low, dangerous hum in the back of my throat. "They are," I confirmed, my voice devoid of inflection. This wasn't a defeat, it was a trigger. The first step wasn't rage, though that simmered, a cold, controlled burn deep within. The first step was Sergeant Major Davies, retired, calling his lawyer. Arthur Kensington was a man who appreciated the finer points of scorched earth litigation, a legal predator with a penchant for meticulously documented overkill. "Arthur," I said, the image of splintered wood and shattered glass, the remnants of my lake cabin, vivid in my mind. "We have a situation. A declaration of war has been made by a suburban homeowners association." There was a pause, then Arthur's dry chuckle. "Against you, John? Are they clinically insane or merely suicidal?" His humor, black as my mood, was a small comfort. I laid out the situation: the destroyed cabin, the ignored warnings, the HOA's belief in their imaginary dominion over my lake, my whole lake lot. "They believe they have rights to my lake, Arthur. They believe they can dictate what happens on property I own outright." His silence this time was appreciative. "This," he finally said, his voice laced with an almost gleeful anticipation, is going to be exquisite. What's your objective? Annihilation? Or merely dismemberment? I considered the shattered frame of my grandfather's window, the one that used to look out over the still morning waters of my lake. Total. And then some. I want them banned from my lake, Arthur. Their boats, their pontooning, their entitled little footsteps on my shoreline. I want them to understand the concept of boundaries with a clarity that will haunt their beige dreams. He made a sound that was probably him steepling his fingers. Consider it done. Phase 1. Injunctive relief. Phase 2. Systematic deconstruction of their authority and finances. They demolished your cabin, John. They'll pay for it in ways they can't yet imagine. The latent authority, the one I'd honed over decades in a different kind of theater, stirred. They hadn't just picked a fight. They'd picked a fight with a man who understood strategy, logistics, and the devastating application of overwhelming force. The initial volley was swift and brutal. Arthur, with the predatory grace of a shark sensing blood, filed for an immediate injunction. The language was precise, legally lethal. It detailed my undisputed ownership of the whole lake lot, attaching deeds, surveys, and a history of ignored correspondence that painted the HOA, and Karen Henderson specifically, as willfully negligent and operating far outside their legal purview. The core of the injunction wasn't just about the demolished lake cabin, it was about the lake itself. We weren't just seeking damages, we were asserting sovereign control. The first order, granted with astonishing speed by a judge who clearly had little patience for HOA overreach when confronted with undeniable property rights, was a temporary restraining order. It explicitly banned any member of the Lakeside Serenity HOA, their families, their guests, their pets, their infernal remote-controlled boats, and most deliciously, their beloved pontooning flotillas, from accessing any part of my lake or the surrounding shoreline I own. The order was served to Karen Henderson during their monthly HOA meeting, a detail Arthur insisted upon for maximum dramatic impact. I pictured her face, that smug, self-satisfied mask cracking as she read the unequivocal terms. No more leisurely sunset cruises on my water. No more weekend fishing expeditions from my banks. No more using my lake as their personal aquatic playground. Their primary community asset, the central selling point of their overpriced little boxes, was now off limits, declared so by the very legal system they had so arrogantly flouted. The day the "No trespassing private property, violators will be prosecuted" signs went up, professionally installed, unambiguous, ringing the entirety of my shoreline, was a quiet victory. They were large, imposing, and printed with the court order number for good measure. I stood on the hill overlooking the lake, the late afternoon sun glinting off its surface, now undisturbed by the usual cacophony of their recreational pursuits. The silence was profound. It was the sound of a boundary being emphatically redrawn. My new fence, a sturdy, no-nonsense barrier, was already being planned. Not just a physical demarcation, but a psychological one. The message was clear. This is mine. Your authority ends where my land begins, and you have just learned that my land extends much further than your wildest, most self-aggrandizing nightmares. The initial outrage from the neighborhood was a predictable wave of sputtering indignation, quickly followed by a dawning horror as the implications set in. Their precious lake access, the cornerstone of their property values, was gone, vanished, because their leader had demolished a small, quiet cabin she had no right to touch. The second phase was to expose the rot. This is where Milo came in. Milo, a caffeine-fueled whirlwind of digital forensics and righteous indignation, was a former military intelligence analyst I'd worked with years ago. He now ran a boutique private investigation firm specializing in unraveling complex financial and procedural knots. "HOAs, Sarge," he'd said when I called, his voice crackling with amusement. "That's like bringing a tactical nuke to a knife fight. But I like it." I sent him the HOA's publicly available documents, their bylaws, their meeting minutes, and the details of the demolition. "Find everything, Milo," I instructed. "Every procedural misstep, every misallocated dollar, every conflict of interest. I want to know how they justified touching my lake cabin, who signed off, and what other skeletons are rattling in their beige closets. Milo attacked the task with the zeal of a conspiracy theorist handed the keys to Area 51. Within days, the information began to flow. The demolition of my lake cabin hadn't even been properly voted on according to their own convoluted bylaws. Karen Henderson had railroaded it through, citing vague emergency powers to remove a hazardous structure. There were no engineering reports, no safety assessments, just her imperious decree. The contractor hired was a cousin of the HOA treasurer, and the invoice was suspiciously inflated. But that was just the surface. Milo, with his unique brand of digital deep diving, uncovered a pattern of financial mismanagement. Funds earmarked for community maintenance were diverted to social committees that primarily benefited Henderson and her inner circle. Contracts were awarded without competitive bids. There were whispers, then documented evidence, of kickbacks and preferential treatment. The Lakeside Serenity HOA wasn't just incompetent, it was corrupt, a petty tyranny built on a foundation of misappropriated funds and delusions of grandeur. Each piece of evidence, a falsified invoice, an email chain revealing Henderson's contempt for due process, a bank statement showing questionable expenditures, was another nail in their coffin. Arthur Kensington was ecstatic. "This isn't just about your demolished cabin anymore, John," he purred. "This is a full-blown RICO case waiting to happen. They haven't just trespassed, they've engaged in a pattern of racketeering. We'll not only get compensation for your cabin, we'll dismantle their entire illicit enterprise." The beauty of it was that their own records, their meticulously kept minutes and financial statements, were their undoing. They had documented their own malfeasance with an almost touching faith in their own invulnerability. The sheer volume of their illegal actions was breathtaking. They'd built their little kingdom on a swamp of bad faith, and now the ground was giving way beneath them. The first legal salvo beyond the injunction was a meticulously detailed letter to the HOA board, CC'd to every homeowner in Lakeside Serenity. It wasn't a negotiation, it was an indictment. It laid out, in cold, hard, legally irrefutable terms, their illegal demolition of my lake cabin, their trespass upon my whole lake lot, and, for added spice, a preliminary summary of Milo's findings regarding financial irregularities and procedural violations. The demand was simple: immediate and full compensation for the demolished cabin, public admission of wrongdoing, and the resignation of the current board. The alternative was a lawsuit that would not only seek punitive damages far exceeding the value of the cabin, but would also formally request state intervention to investigate their financial affairs. The silence from Karen Henderson was, for a few days, absolute. I imagined the panic spreading through their ranks, the frantic phone calls, the dawning realization that their reign of petty terror was about to have very real, very expensive consequences. The supporting neighbors, previously whispering their discontent, started to find their voices. Anonymous flyers detailing the HOA's predicament, likely fueled by leaks from our carefully constructed information campaign, began appearing on mailboxes. The narrative was shifting. Henderson was no longer the strong leader protecting community values. She was the reckless gambler who had bet their access to the lake, their financial stability, on a stupid, arrogant power play, and lost spectacularly. Her attempts to rally support were met with stony silence or, increasingly, open hostility. The charm offensive she launched, all saccharine smiles and reassurances, fell flat. People weren't interested in her excuses. They were interested in why their boats were now landlocked and why their property values were plummeting, because she couldn't distinguish between HOA common ground and private property. The ban on using my lake was the most potent weapon. It was a daily, visible reminder of her catastrophic misjudgment. Every time they looked at that shimmering, inaccessible water, they thought of her. Every canceled pontooning party, every child whining about not being able to swim, was a fresh indictment. The entire neighborhood was now feeling the direct consequences of her actions. It was beautiful, in a surgically precise, legally lethal sort of way. The pressure was building, a slow, inexorable squeeze. They had started this with a bulldozer. I was finishing it with the relentless, crushing weight of the law and their own exposed incompetence. The lawsuit, when filed, was a work of art. Arthur had outdone himself. It wasn't just about the monetary value of the demolished lake cabin. It was about the principle. It detailed the wanton destruction, the arrogant disregard for property rights, the emotional distress, and, crucially, the HOA's demonstrable pattern of acting ultra vires beyond their legal powers. We attached Milo's preliminary report as an appendix, a ticking time bomb of potential further legal action. The claim was, for $750, zero for the cabin, replacement cost, sentimental value assessed by experts in antique structure valuation, and punitive damages for the sheer audacity of their illegal actions. We also included claims for legal fees and the cost of securing my property, including the new fencing that was now a formidable barrier around my lake lot. The local news, always hungry for a good David versus Goliath story, especially one involving a tyrannical HOA, picked it up almost immediately. Local HOA demolishes man's cabin, discovers he owns entire lake, bans neighborhood from water, was a headline too juicy to ignore. Suddenly, Karen Henderson wasn't just a neighborhood nuisance. She was a local pariah, the face of HOA overreach and incompetence. Her carefully cultivated image of serene authority shattered. The news reports featured aerial shots of my pristine, empty lake, juxtaposed with images of the no trespassing signs and quotes from disgruntled homeowners who now understood the true extent of their HOA's folly. The silent majority wasn't silent anymore. They were angry, and they were vocal. An emergency residents meeting was called, not by Henderson, but by a newly formed Concerned Homeowners Committee. Henderson's attempts to control the narrative were futile. She was shouted down, questioned, and openly mocked. The evidence we had disseminated was now common knowledge. Her power, built on bluff and bluster, evaporated under the harsh glare of public scrutiny and impending legal doom. The HOA's lawyer, a local attorney clearly out of his depth, advised them to settle. His panicked calls to Arthur became increasingly desperate. Arthur, enjoying himself immensely, let him squirm. "My client is not inclined to be merciful, counselor," he'd say, his voice like velvet over steel. "He wishes to make an example." The tactical operation was proceeding flawlessly. The enemy was demoralized, their leadership discredited, their resources dwindling. The public reckoning was in full swing. The courtroom was less a battlefield and more an execution chamber. Karen Henderson, stripped of her presidential bluster, looked small and deflated. The HOA's defense was pathetic, a series of weak protestations that they believed they were acting in the community's best interest, that they misunderstood the property lines. Arthur dismantled their arguments with surgical precision, presenting the clear deeds to my whole lake lot, the ignored warnings, the photographic evidence of the demolished lake cabin, and the damning internal HOA communications Milo had unearthed. He presented expert testimony on the value of the cabin, not just its materials, but its historical and familial significance. He painted a picture of an HOA drunk on its own petty power, led by a delusional president who saw fit to destroy private property with impunity. When the judge, a stern woman with a no-nonsense demeanor, addressed Henderson directly, asking her to explain the basis for her belief that she had the authority to demolish a structure on clearly marked private land, Henderson stammered, offering vague platitudes about community standards. The judge's expression was one of profound unimpressibility. The verdict was swift and decisive. The HOA was found liable for trespass, destruction of property, and a string of procedural violations that bordered on outright fraud regarding the authorization for the demolition. The compensation awarded was exactly what we asked for: $750. A separate order mandated a full, independent audit of the HOA's finances, with a clear indication that criminal charges could follow depending on the findings. The court also made the injunction permanent. The Lakeside Serenity HOA and its members were banned from my lake and its shoreline in perpetuity, unless they secured my express written permission, something I had no intention of ever granting. Their boats would never again break the surface of my water. Their pontooning days were a distant, bitter memory. The illegal actions of the HOA were not just exposed, they were adjudicated, punished, and recorded for posterity. The judgment wasn't just a financial blow, it was a public humiliation, a complete repudiation of Henderson's tyranny. Her reign was over. The look on her face as the judgment was read was worth more than any monetary sum. It was the look of someone whose carefully constructed world of self-importance had been utterly and irrevocably demolished. The aftermath was predictably chaotic for Lakeside Serenity. The $750,000 judgment, coupled with their own legal fees, and the impending audit, bankrupted the HOA. Karen Henderson resigned in disgrace, her name forever synonymous with arrogance and catastrophic misjudgment. Most of the board followed suit. The Concerned Homeowners Committee took over, faced with the monumental task of rebuilding trust and solvency, and, most pressingly, figuring out how to pay the judgment. Special assessments were levied, leading to more anger and recrimination. Several homes went up for sale, their owners eager to escape the dysfunctional, lakeless community. My lake, however, returned to a state of tranquility it hadn't known in years. The new fence stood as a silent sentinel, a clear demarcation of where their world ended and mine began. The no trespassing signs remained, stark reminders of the price of their folly. I hired the best local craftsmen, and a new lake cabin began to rise from the ashes of the old. It was similar in spirit to my grandfather's design, but stronger, built with the quiet defiance of a man who had defended his legacy and won. The $750,000 compensation covered the construction with plenty to spare, a fund now set aside for the long-term preservation of the whole lake lot, ensuring it would remain a sanctuary. There was a somber satisfaction in watching the new cabin take shape, a physical manifestation of resilience. The protective loyalty I felt for that land, for the memories it held, had been tested, and I had met the challenge. The emotional undercurrents, the righteous fury, had been channeled into a cold, calculated campaign that achieved not just vengeance, but a restoration of order. The local corruption, the petty tyranny of the HOA, had been exposed and dismantled piece by piece, document by document. The locked gate at the entrance to my property wasn't just a physical barrier, it was psychological closure. They had learned, the hard way, that some lines are not to be crossed, some properties are not to be touched, and some people are not to be trifled with. They had sought to expand their dominion. They had succeeded only in losing the one thing that gave their community its allure: my lake. The intense personal cost of their actions was something they never factored into their arrogant calculus. They saw an old lake cabin. I saw a repository of irreplaceable memories, the laughter of my children, the quiet wisdom of my father, the enduring presence of my grandfather. The demolition wasn't just property damage. It was an attack on the very fabric of my family's heritage. This understanding fueled the cold-blooded calm of my response, a calm that many mistook for detachment but was, in reality, the deep, still water beneath which powerful currents of resolve moved. My legal strategy was indeed a tactical operation, each step planned with the precision of a military campaign. The initial injunction was the beachhead, securing the immediate territory, my lake. The research Milo conducted was the intelligence gathering, exposing the enemy's weaknesses and illegal actions. The lawsuit was the main offensive, designed for maximum impact and public reckoning. The public embarrassment of Karen Henderson and her cohorts was not a byproduct, it was a specific objective. True justice, in this case, required not just compensation but a clear, public dismantling of their illegitimate authority. The supporting neighbors, initially a silent majority, became crucial in shifting the local narrative once they were armed with the truth about the HOA's malfeasance and the true ownership of the whole lake lot. Their transition from intimidated residents to active participants in the HOA's downfall was a testament to the power of exposed truth. The new lake cabin stands now, a quiet monument to resilience. The porch light, a warm beacon in the twilight, is a symbol of return, of control reclaimed. The lake itself, pristine and undisturbed by the buzzing of their boats or the raucous laughter from their pontooning parties, is perhaps the greatest trophy. It is quiet. It is mine. The blood metaphor, while not literal, resonates in the moral cost they paid for their transgression, their reputation, their financial stability, their community's central focus. They drew first blood, metaphorically speaking, when they demolished my history. My response was a meticulously executed exsanguination of their power. The precision of the language used throughout this ordeal, from my initial letters to Arthur's legal filings, was a weapon. Every word was chosen for its legal weight and its psychological impact. There was no room for ambiguity, no space for misinterpretation. This was particularly evident in the wording of the ban. All individuals affiliated with the Lakeside Serenity Homeowners Association, including but not limited to residents, their families, guests, and invitees, are henceforth prohibited from accessing, traversing, or utilizing in any manner the body of water known as My Lake's name and its contiguous shoreline, as delineated in the attached survey map, which constitutes the whole lake lot under the private ownership of John Davies. There was a certain poetic justice in using their own bureaucratic tendencies against them, but with the unassailable backing of actual law. The slow-burning moral authority I felt stemmed from the absolute certainty of my position, not just legally, but ethically. They were wrong, profoundly and demonstrably so. My actions were not born of malice, though a cold fury was undeniably present, but from a deep-seated need to rectify a grievous wrong and protect what was sacred to me. The use of military jargon in my private thoughts, tactical ops, objective, collateral damage, referring to the HOA's self-inflicted wounds, was a natural extension of a lifetime spent thinking in terms of strategy and consequence. It provided a framework for navigating the emotional turmoil with a degree of detachment necessary for effective action. The surprise reversal for them was not just that I owned the lake, but the speed and comprehensiveness of my counterattack. They expected a disgruntled homeowner. They got a prepared adversary with significant resources and an unyielding will. They thought they were swatting a fly. They discovered they had kicked a hornet's nest built by a creature with access to a very good lawyer and a deep understanding of leverage. The narrative concludes, not with a triumphant roar, but with the quiet satisfaction of justice served, of boundaries re-established, and of peace restored to my small corner of the world, a peace they so rudely shattered, and for which they paid an exorbitant but entirely appropriate price. Their illegal actions led to their downfall, and my demolished lake cabin was rebuilt on a foundation of their costly lesson.